in 2010, Wacom was made open source and released at version 1.9. And that version has basically remained frozen in time since that release. Now, of course, Wacom back in the day, especially in the 90s, was notable for having had very robust support for 32-bit DOS extender technology. It was actually used by many software developers in the gaming industry, namely id Software, Apogee, and Core Design, as they heavily pursued the 32-bit DOS game development space for actually a number of years before Windows 95 took off. So that was kind of its biggest claim to fame. And the DOS extenders used most often for compiled software were under Wacom, where it was used DOS4GW. So what does that even mean? What is DOS4GW? The 4G in the name stands for the 4 gigabyte limit for 32-bit software, because when you unlocked the protected mode in Intel 386 processor and above, you had a flat memory model that could address up to 4 gigabytes of memory. And then the W in that 4GW stands for Wacom, because they made a special version. And by they, I'm referring to Rational Systems. That was the company that originally developed that DOS extender. And that kind of, I guess they bundled it with Wacom back in the day, so it was kind of like a special deal. So there was also, for the 286, they also had a DOS 16M, which, as that would imply, meant the 16 megabyte limit that could be addressed by protected mode of the 286 processor. But that didn't really get too much traction, because once we got to the 386, 4 gigabyte limit was a far more enticing target. So DOS 16M kind of fell by the wayside. So as far as OpenWatcom and getting it for your ArcaOS environment and that sort of thing, there are two versions of OpenWatcom in the wild. You have version 1.9. This was the release that Sybase made in 2010 prior to their acquisition by SAP. And then there's version 2.0 beta, which is a living, breathing port, and it's been available ever since 2015. So when you do search for OpenWatcom and say Google or Bing, one of the first results that you're going to see is for the version 1.9 release that would be at openwatcom.org. So that could possibly confuse some folks. And it's not that 1.9 can't be used for ArcaOS development, but as you'll see here in a minute, you probably don't want to download that here, and you'll understand why. So instead, if you want to get to the 2.0 release, you want to get to their GitHub project. And they have these current builds that I believe are either weekly or bi-weekly. And it comes out on a rotating basis. And the URL for the GitHub page is right there. So you go to the releases, and they have releases for OS2, in this case, or ArcaOS, 32-bit and 64-bit Windows and Linux, which is going to be kind of interesting as well for development purposes. And there's a screenshot here of what that download link would look like if you go to the GitHub repository. Yes, you have a question?
Can you go back to the last slide for 2 seconds?
Yeah, sure.
Just want to check my typing here. OpenWatcom. Thank you.
Hey, you're so welcome. Are you good? Awesome. So yes, when you go to that URL, and this is the screenshot I took as of several days ago, but basically you'll just go to the current build. It says pre-release, and then you'll download the one that says COS2, because they also do offer a version for Fortran 77, so you'll want to make sure you pick the correct release. So what are the kind of improvements that you're going to get with 2.0 beta over 1.9? I'm glad you asked. So there are a few, there's actually quite a number of them, but I picked, I think, the most noteworthy of the differences that I think would be worth talking about. The DOS tools do support LFNs, or long file names. So say if you wanted to make a utility that would perhaps run on DOS and OS2, I'm just going to give an example. It would be nice to have a DOS exe that is able to recognize long file names beyond the 8.3 file size limit, because classic DOS, as we all know, has a 8.3 character limit, so 8 characters before the period and 3 after. OpenWatcom 2.0 beta also now supports 64-bit hosts natively. Now, on a Windows host, say if you wanted to write software for ArcaOS or OS2 on a Windows machine, this really isn't that big of a deal because you can run 32-bit executables just fine on 64-bit Windows, and there's really no perceivable difference that I can tell. But say on a Linux host, say if you're running Linux and you're especially trying to run it stripped down without a lot of extra, stuff that's tied into it, this might be actually interesting for you to hear, because with a 64-bit version, not only do you have access to the whole memory space available to you, but you don't need to install multilib. And multilib, typically a extra package that you would install. Most Linux distributions just have it as something you would just type out in the package management. And the multilib allows you to basically run 32-bit Linux binaries because it takes all the 32-bit versions of libraries you may already have on your system and makes those available to you. But that does consume extra disk space, and that's more stuff that you have to update. And some folks prefer to just go pure 64-bit. So having the 64-bit host support is kind of a nice feature. Not particularly relevant for if you're running this on ArcaOS, that's always going to be 32-bit. There's also an OpenWatcom text editor, and it's available as a standalone application. If you wanted to use that by itself for whatever reason, you are able to do so. And finally, there's a two-phase build system. So OpenWatcom can, of course, be built by its own compiler, but you could also use native C and C compilers that might be present on ArcaOS or whatever other host operating system you're using. And by that I mean you could use something like CMake, or you could use GCC, and theoretically you can compile the OpenWatcom source code and it will actually work. It's designed to actually be able to behave correctly under those parameters, which you would probably be wondering and asking yourself, why would I even do that? Why not just use OpenWatcom? Well, CMake, for instance, does tend to support multi-threading for its compilation efforts, so you could compile your programs much quicker. Say if you have like a Threadripper or something, that might be of interest, so you can save some time. So, installing OpenWatcom. When you download, you do have your choice between a version of OpenWatcom for C++ and C, or for Fortran 77. For the purpose of this presentation, we're just talking about the former. The installer is an exe style application and not a warp-in bundle, so it just presents itself like a normal exe installer. And the installer does ask what kind of compilers that you wish to include in your installation, such as DOS, Win 3.1, NT9X and Win32s, Linux 32-bit, and of course OS2 as a target. So here's just a couple screenshots I took. So you have your installer. This is when it first starts up. You pick your path where you want to put it. It defaults to C, :/Watcom. That's where I would put it. And then this is the options menu. This is where you can, if you wanted to pick and choose like a kitchen, if you wanted to do that, you could. And you click into these individual buttons. For instance, the 16-bit one, you click in there and it would give you the different memory modes. Like I think there's normal, huge, gigantic, something like that. If you're wanting to compile a 16-bit application for some reason, you have that ability. And then you have your 32-bit modes, and then your targets. The targets are for the target operating system that you wish to compile your programs to, and that's where you select whatever operating systems. By default, OpenWatcom does select everything, and if for whatever reason you want to slim down your install, you can go in there and deselect things that you're not planning on targeting. And then there's host operating system. You typically, again, want to leave that be. It should automatically select OS2 because it's auto-detecting based on what system you're on that, so you're on a OS2 host. If you pick any other host, you're just getting all these other executables that A, you can't really run or are not going to be very useful to you, and two, you're just taking up disk space. So, and then the toolkits and other components are other miscellaneous accessories, some additional tools that you could use to help make your development life a little bit easier. So, some of the standout features that OpenWatcom has that might prove useful, or will prove useful, I should say. You have wlink.exe, that is the Watcom linker utility, which is useful for compiling code from the command line. So you could just invoke wlink in your .c file, and it'll, build kind of like a make command, basically. Then you have your IDE. It's IDE.exe, and this is the graphical development environment that allows you to write code, run, and debug all from one place. It is a bit of a dated look and feel, but if a 90s aesthetic is what you like, then you're going to feel right at home. There's another program called TechInfo, and this lists all the OS2 environment variables in a handy display console, complete with page breaks. So instead of you having to go into each individual .ini file in your OS2 system directory, you just run this and it'll scrub through all your files and show you what your path variables and whatever else that you may have all in one place. You also have your WASM program. This is for Watcom assembler files. So if you have a .asm that you made, the WASM program will compile that as well. And finally, I think most interestingly, you got a VI program, so like VI text editor. And as we'll see here in just a second when I show more screenshots, the VI program's actually a little bit more visually interesting looking than your typical VI program, which typically is just little squiggly lines going down each row. So here's the WLink program. I just took a screenshot of kind of some of the parameters you could pass to be able to link files, and you can even tell at the top, this beta came out in June 14th of 2024, so the releases are quite recent. They're always churning out new ones all the time. And here's a screenshot of the IDE. So you have on your left, you have your source tree explorer, so you can go into the different C or CPP files that you may have in your project. And then once you select a file in your source files, you can pull it up in an editor that's also built into the IDE, so you can do your normal programming, do your includes and all your normal programming activities. Here's a quick screenshot of the TechInfo screen. So you can see here we got the different parameters, and this is for Watcom C in this particular screenshot. It shows the Watcom C environment variables, but also go into your OS2 system files as well and show those parameters. And then at the bottom it says press enter to continue, because it's basically, it does it by page, so it doesn't scroll the entire thing and you're like, oh crap, what else was there? So it automatically does that for you. And here's the Watcom assembler program. Once again, very similar to any other compiler, but this time designed more for assembly. And the VI program. So like I was saying earlier, it looks a little bit more advanced. It actually has a file menu at the top, but so it's a little bit more intuitive, I guess I should say, versus trying to figure out, oh, you have to type colon and then some sort of esoteric character to either save the file or quit and all that, but you have a little bit more visual cues for how you can work in files. And the cool part too is Watcom does update your path, so when you go into, say, a C prompt, you don't have to navigate to where this lives in the Watcom directory. You can invoke VI from wherever you want, and it will fire up in that directory. Now, there are a couple possible drawbacks, although they are few in number. There are a few potential downsides to note. As I did allude to earlier, the user interface and the tools are a bit dated. It's, I guess, to be expected with something of this caliber. And it does have a bit of a split personality. So there is like one or two utilities in the Watcom directory that use a Win3x interface instead of a OS2 style interface, which I thought was kind of interesting. One of them was the virtual DOS machine debug utility, which I believe you have it running in the background while you're running DOS code that you have compiled, and it brings up information as you're doing so, and then that uses a Win16 interface. There's also some other considerations like C99. That's a newer version of the C language. So ANSI C is C89, so that's the classic C that pretty much will work anywhere. If you wanted to use something like C99, like if you wanted to use C++ style comments, or there are some considerations and additions for SMP support in C99, or just things that makes it SMP aware. Those kind of advanced features, there's only some support for this in OpenWatcom. You typically need to pass extra flags to enable this support. It's like highly experimental. And they don't truly recommend that you use it if you don't really need to use C99, because it's not going to support the whole feature set of C99 to begin with. So they'd recommend, whenever possible, you just stick with C89, which is ANSI C, and then you don't have to worry about any sort of potential issues down the road when you attempt to compile. And from my research, it appears that OpenWatcom is a bit clunky for working with multi-byte characters. It was designed in the era of code page 437, so that's, as Alex alluded to in his talk just last talk ago. He was talking about the different code pages, and IBM's character set is for English, and ASCII English would be code page 437. That's kind of where you want to sort of live in. If you did want to use some fancier character sets, you could pass parameters to OpenWatcom to handle those, but it's a bit of a mixed bag. So something to keep in mind. You want to keep things simple. And if you're a free software license person, if you're really curious about this part, OpenWatcom is licensed under the Sybase OpenWatcom Public License Agreement, which is it's a little bit strange. So it's more copyleft than GPL. You would think that wasn't possible, because you know how Richard M. Stallman is like a stalwart of copyleft, but it is more copyleft, but it also has a termination clause. And from what I was able to gather in my research, say if Sybase, or in this case SAP, were to bring forth a lawsuit against you for a patent violation or something, you could have your rights to the code terminated in that situation. They actually have a carve out so that they could just, if they want to, they can flip a switch and say, actually, you're no longer allowed to use the code under that license. Which means, although this license is OSI compatible, which is Open Source Institute, I believe is what that is. Thank you, Open Source Initiative. They're a more liberal organization. They have a much broader definition of what open source means. But FSF, or the Free Software Foundation, and there's a few other orgs, do not consider it a true open source or free software license because of those termination clauses that can cause complications in the theoretical, event of a patent lawsuit, or you butt heads with the wrong person at SAP. The likelihood of that happening is, I would say, almost next to nil, but it's in the license and it's kind of problematic. But the good news is, any software you write in OpenWatcom, it's not viral in the sense that if you compile software in OpenWatcom, you have to use that license. It's only, it only has to do with the source code for OpenWatcom itself. So if you make changes, whatever you do, it has to be under this public license agreement. Yeah, pretty short call, really short conversation here. Just kind of wanted to bring awareness to the tool. Normally I would have had a demo, but again, the laptop I had for that, unfortunately, died midway through my trip. So, but if you do have any other questions, and if you're curious, I do have another laptop. It's my other ThinkPad. I do have it installed on there if you wanted to play with it, but no proper demo has been prepared for that. But did anyone have any questions?
Well, it's not a question exactly, but the C++ support is pretty bad. It's very old, doesn't support several new levels of C++. Plus the STL, some genius decided to write their own rather than using an available implementation at the time. So if you're doing that kind of coding, it's not so great. So.
Yeah, that tracks, because just like C99, and that's almost, that's like 25 years ago or so, and that still isn't fully supported. But like C++, if I recall, I remember it used to be, the next version used to be called C++ 0x. So they didn't know what year it was going to come out. They eventually came out with it in 2011, I believe. And that's even newer than like C99, and a lot of the older style compilers and tool chains opted not to really bake that in because they decided to just stick with what the classic use case was. So yeah, I think what you touched on there, David, is 100% correct. It is definitely a little more dated. But again, what we're dealing with here with ArcaOS and the kind of software you write for it, it's probably not a big deal missing those types of features. If you know your basic C++ or your basic C programming, it's not like you're seriously going to be missing any of those features. But they're nice to haves for sure. But
The one, sorry.
no, go ahead.
Yeah, the one kind of reservation that keeps me from really going to OpenWatcom is when you compare it to both GCC and Visual Age, its build system is very different. Like the makefile syntax is completely different from the Unix style makefile. Well, I mean, it's still a makefile, but there's just a lot of the syntax is very, very different, which means coming from, say, a GCC background, you're going to find it weird. And since I do come from that background, it is kind of just like I can't get used to it.
Also, the linker in it is a better linker than in the IBM compiler, because there was some limit issues with the IBM one, but this Wacom linker can handle more symbols or something. Like when they built Mozilla, they had to switch to it to get it to link.
Yeah, and actually, it's funny you bring that up too. I think Wacom is actually used by the VirtualBox project for some I don't know if it's the BIOS files or whatnot, but yeah, OpenWatcom does have use even outside of this particular context.
Right, and when you
So,
use GCC, you configure it to use that linker.
yeah,
It's also really nice if you have to write 16-bit code that you can do that in OS2.
yes, yes. It is. It's quite convenient, and I mean, in the off chance you wanted to write a 16-bit OS2 app, it does have support to do that as well.
You
So,
can write a 16-bit Windows app and
Yep.
compile it on OS2, and it will compile for that target with the OS2 version of the compiler.
exactly. And it does also have the Win32S support or it's like a subset, thank you, that's what I was trying to get at. Yeah, so it is a subset, so if you have Win32s installed, even I think WinOS 2 supports up to version 1.25, if I'm remembering correctly. So not the very latest version, but it's late enough. You should be able to compile things if you wanted to use Win32 subset. You can compile it out, and then you can test your code right there on your WinOS 2 session. So which is kind of convenient. Another thing I should note too, if you were writing DOS software and you wanted to use a DOS extender, yeah, DOS4GW is typically the recommended default, but they do support FARLAP extenders. So the FARLAP, I think it's FARLAP 386, is supported by Wacom. You just have to specify it as a build time option. But
Matt, did you find any other community that also uses OpenWatcom? You say like VirtualBox, but I don't know if...
yeah, the Wikipedia page touched on a few of these things. There actually is, it's funny you bring up the word community because there actually is a Discord group for the OpenWatcom project. I mean, there's only, I'd say, 15 members in that group that are active at any given time, and it's not the most busy group, but they're actually very responsive. I asked a quick question about the C99 support. I was just kind of curious, and I got a response back within 10 minutes. So it is a very small community, but they seemingly have a passion for the project and what it can do. And the fact that, especially if you're nostalgic for DOS or OS2 or whatever, the fact that you're able to have a modern in the sense of a project that's still being actively worked on, compiler and toolchain, available for download and freely available. You don't have to pay boatloads of money like you used to probably have to do for IBM's tools. It's nice to have that right there. Any other questions? All right, very good. Well, thank you very much for attending the presentation, and this is the last one for the day. So.